week 1, you might be coming in and like, let's say you're doing a max effort day. So your max effort day might be, let's say, a trap bar deadlift. That's week 1. And we might be having you go up to the heaviest you can go for 5 with chains on the bar. And then week 2, maybe we're having you do like a wide stance box squat. And let's say that week we're having you go up to the heaviest you can go for 1. And then week 3 might be a narrow stance squat. So with that week, maybe you're going up to the heaviest you can go for 5. And then that would be kind of your like base 3 weeks. And then you would kind of cycle back through that again, except week 4 would be the trap bar deadlift again, but maybe you're not doing it with chains. And maybe this time, instead of doing the heaviest you can go for 8, maybe you're doing the heaviest you can go for 1, and that's off blocks. So you're constantly repeating those same 3 main core lifts that you have. So trap bar deadlift, wide stance box squat, narrow stance box squat, and then you're just kind of changing the rep schemes and the implements that you use on those exercises.
That was Grant Fowler, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by our longtime sponsor, Simply Faster. There are a lot of sports technology companies out there, but Simply Faster is the only website you can go to that features an online store that covers the bandwidth of training technology, from force plates to timing systems to muscle stimulators and more. Some products of Simply Faster that I use and love include things like the Freelap timing system in K-Box or coach's favorites such as GymAware. Recently, Simply Faster has added 2 units that as a coach you should definitely take a look at. The first is the Muscle Lab Contact Grid, which is an extremely affordable and portable, step-by-step, literally, system to collect data on jumps, bounds, sprints, agility, hurdle hops, and really as much as your creative mind can imagine. In what used to take a whole runway worth of data collecting strips, the Contact Grid does it all with only 2 small strips that together cover up to 40 meters of sprinting. Ground contact time, step rates, rhythms, and beyond are at your fingertips with this device. Another new unit, the VO2 Master, is an ultra-portable gas exchange analyzer. Don't guess on energy system development when you can get direct insight into VO2 capabilities in relation to specific sports skills, rather than being hooked up to tubes on a treadmill or worse yet, a cycle ergometer to get a VO2 max. Think of the VO2 Master as your own gas exchange lab without the tubes and wires. Deepen your analysis in the specific conditioning preparation of your athletes with the VO2 Master today. These products and incredible customer service make Simply Faster your go-to for your sports technology needs. I'm happy to have partnered with them in sponsoring this podcast. Their support has been tremendous, so check them out today at simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. Today's episode features guest Grant Fowler, and we are talking programming design and athlete adaptation. Grant Fowler is the owner of Fowler Fitness in the Woodlands, Texas. Grant is a creative coach who is a performance consultant both in person and online. He's been getting fantastic results with his athletes in the realm of speed, strength, and power. When I put out some lines on social media as to guests that you guys wanted to see on the show, Grant Fowler was a guy who came up multiple times with people noting that he was someone who was doing programming different, more creatively. He had a unique system of thinking. And so naturally, me being curious and loving programming, I reached out to Grant. He's on the show, and we really had an awesome talk. Really enjoyed it. Grant also is doing programming for Kevin Foster, who's been a previous guest and a frequent writer on JustFlySports.com. And Kevin, in his own training for the 2020 Olympic trials in javelin, has remarked to me how great of results he's been getting with Grant, setting regular gym PRs, doing so more easily, and really just has been really just blown away by what he's able to do and accomplish under Grant's programming. So we're going to explore Grant's ideology today. It comes from a little bit of a non-traditional, or I should say very non-traditional place, in the sense that he didn't go through the typical university system, the typical certification educational system. He created a system really from his own experimentation and his thirst for knowledge. Today he's going to share how that came about and what that is. He's going to go into its connections, his programming's connections to Westside, how he shuffles max effort days, dynamic days, auxiliary work, and how each of those days are nuanced as to the needs of sport athletes and not necessarily powerlifters, and how frequently each of those, and they're all a little bit different, those stimuli are cycled in and out of the program, how they're changed and tweaked along as his athletes go through their process. We also have a fun talk, an important talk on this barometer between kind of more fixed and regular training stimuli, I think the Bondarchuk training system, or even like a 1x20 versus something that's like a 14-day cycle, a 21-day cycle. Things are getting switched around, a lot more novelty in the program. And it really brings a lot of important questions to light. It really got me thinking about elements of my own programming. And this was just a really great chat, a fun chat with Grant Fowler. And I think you guys are really going to enjoy it as well. The more I have talks like this, the more I think about this whole programming equation. There's the science and the art of it. And I look at the art as like almost like mixing beats on a computer. You have all these different sounds and instruments coming in at different durations, different frequencies, different rhythms. And it makes me think of how Grant is looking at his maximal efforts, his dynamic efforts, and his auxiliaries as he goes through his program. And I've seen that in other elite programming coaches who are elite at programming as well. And it's just cool to think about. I love talking about this stuff. And so let's get on to it. Episode 190 with Grant Fowler of Fowler Fitness. Grant, how was your start to coaching different than the typical coaching route, or how we typically get into this field?
Well, to start, I never really went to school for anything, sports science or exercise physiology related. I actually went to school initially for business marketing, and I think in a lot of ways, I'm kind of grateful that the whole sports science academia scene never really shaped a lot of my early views on training. And I actually made a post about that the other day. I was kind of talking about how I think a lot of people tend to get almost pigeonholed by their education, because on one hand, you're definitely going to be learning a lot of job specific practical material with your degree. But unfortunately, I think that's where a lot of people tend to stop. They kind of have a hard time being able to draw and or like extrapolate information from other fields. So, I mean, that's kind of really my background from an educational standpoint. I went to school for business marketing, so I don't really have, a super heavy background in anything, sports science or training related. So the creativity part of it, I think definitely was able to be cultivated from that, because you kind of don't have a lot of those, things in your head from your education that sometimes I think can hold you back a little bit. Again, on one hand, it is useful because you're learning the specifics of, whatever it is that you're going to be doing. But at the same time, I think if you kind of stay stuck in that space, sometimes that can kind of be a limit on what you can do, creatively.
Yeah. Two of my greatest mentors two of my great mentors in the coaching space. One was a music major in college and another was a sculpting major in college. And it's awesome when you start to see some of those themes show up in how they approach the practice. And I do think it's, like what you just said. I've had discussions with my colleague Paul Cater about this, but people who start coaching and their base is the academia, and then they go, versus people who have been in it creatively for 6, 7, 8, 10 years and then get into the academia. And so I think that there's a very powerful difference between the two. I was going to ask as well, your background in just training as an athlete. I'm sure you've started and enjoyed training from a pretty young age.
Yeah, so I did pretty much every single sport, up until I was probably, I guess, a junior in high school. So, I played soccer, I did basketball, I played baseball. I wasn't really good at any of them. But then I kind of started to get into jiu-jitsu, and that was kind of one of the things that, I really enjoyed. And so I was able to kind of excel in that, not to a high degree, but because it was something that I enjoyed a little bit more than the other sports, I was kind of able to get pretty proficient, at that. I did powerlifting. I did track for a little while. And again, I sucked at most of those as well. And it's kind of funny because, now that I'm, into training, you kind of look back on a lot of the things that you did, in high school, and you kind of wish that you knew what you knew now. I think I could have been a lot more successful in, some of those sports that I played. It was just kind of defeating because, you get injuries, you get those small nagging aches and pains. And sometimes the desire to excel in the sport, isn't really there if you're constantly dealing with a lot of those issues.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of coaches look at areas and that we all want to go back on and say, yeah, I wish I would have done this differently. I think that there is that for sure. Sometimes I look at, and I thought about this recently about my college track experience, and maybe it would have been like this, maybe it wouldn't, but this kind of goes with what you were saying about, I think, the creative elements. And it was a mixture. Like when I was competing as a track and field college competitor, I really don't think I would have jumped quite as high or maybe as far if I went to a typical university where they're like, okay, here's the workout, you're going to do it, and there's no creative input on my own end. My college experience was, and I was fortunate my coach let me do this, and I think he realized my need to put my own creative input in, but there was a basic workout structure, but the jump days, if it was a jump day, it would basically be me kind of doing my own thing. And I also, a lot of times, would do an extra with the coach's blessing, plyometric or a shot, like sometimes throw in medicine balls on like a Saturday or something like that. But I was given enough creative lead to do a little bit of my own thing, and I think it actually worked really well. And if I wouldn't have had that, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have done the marks that I did. And I also learned a lot from it in hindsight. I also did some really stupid stuff. The stupidest of which was I decided I was reading like some West Side stuff and some band training, and like 3 weeks before the national meet, I decided to do some squats with the green jump stretch bands on them. And my max was not very good to begin with. And I had a ton of band tension at the top relative to it's the first time I had done it. And I was sore for like a week. I was definitely sore for a week after that. And even I remember the way I was getting up off the ground at the national meet was a little bit longer ground contact time. Like it wasn't quite that. There was other reasons for that too, but that was a very dumb Joel decided to do his own thing moment there that I would absolutely go back and change if I could. We learn a lot from those experiences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's you kind of have to have that balance between somebody else giving you some structure until you don't need it anymore, and then you kind of having that ability to kind of modify your training intuitively on the fly.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I needed that structure very badly in college. It was a situation where I didn't have any structure really my first couple of years, very little, because I don't know why I did this. I could tell you why, but it's a different discussion, but I was a sports medicine athletic training major for 2 years. And so I missed a lot of track practices and spent time in the I had to spend time training room hours instead. And some of the stuff I was doing was extremely, extremely poor. And then I quit my sophomore year, and then I just started practicing with the team my junior year, and my high jump went up 4 inches and my triple jump went up 4 feet. But a lot of that was environmental too, like just sprinting with other people and doing all that in the whole 9 yards.
Kind of that competitive component.
Yes. Oh, and I run off that. Like, to me, I think that's important for everybody, but I really need that. But yeah, it was important. Yeah, I agree. I think that like with the general structure until you can do it yourself. So I think it was interesting for me. You've been training for a long time, like since probably like a lot of people, but age like 13, you were telling me before the show, something like that, like very early you started.
Yeah. No, I've been interested in training for a while. I mean, I remember when I was, I think around 13 or 14, I was like reading articles on T Nation and stuff. And like, obviously like T Nation is kind of, I think now it's like the information might not be as relevant as kind of it used to be when they had a lot of, different coaches on there. But, back in the day, like T Nation was kind of like, that was like the place to start because you had access to, all these good coaches. Like, you're getting introduced to like Poliquin and like, Dave Tate and all these guys. And so you kind of had this pool of like, experts in their own, unique fields, I guess you could say. So like powerlifting, and then, you had guys in like the sports performance realm. And so, it was kind of nice because you could sort of read some of those articles, and then you could branch out and kind of find some of these coaches and dive into their work a little bit. So that's actually kind of how I started to learn a lot about training was just from websites like that, and then kind of, branching off.
Yeah, I remember when I was in my mid-20s coaching track, I had put it upon myself at one point. I'm like, I'm going to read one T Nation article, a day or a week or something. But now I would never do that. I would never. I mean, it's still, there's occasionally some good stuff on there. It's just a different market and marketing tactic now, the way that they go.
Sure,
It's just a little different for coaches. But yeah, man, and so programming. One of the things that I really am excited to talk with you about, because I know you think differently about it. So just talking about your background and how you got started and where your thoughts and interests are. What are the biggest influences you've had in the approach to training athletes that you have now?
Well, in terms of the actual periodization structure, I'd say Louis Simmons would probably be a big one. I think in terms of the conjugate system itself, I think too many people focus on kind of the specifics of what's being done in that system and less on the structure of the system itself. Which is basically kind of founded on the existence of these nonlinear systems or dynamics. So the entire premise behind, a nonlinear or an undulating form of periodization or training is that nothing to begin with is going to adapt in a linear fashion. And even on sort of like this macro level, kind of in like just a general life, I guess you could say perspective, nothing in a complex system, behaves in this linear way. And so it's partially this kind of unpredictability that's sort of like the underlying driver of adaptation on one hand, and then also keeping athletes engaged in the training itself. So a nonlinear program really is just, built in a way that kind of respects, I guess you could say, like the native structure or the kind of the clock that the body operates on, so to speak. And while I think there's kind of some short-term advantages to, certain linear approaches or specific linear, training plans, I think you always need to fall back to this non-linear structure. And it's funny because if you look at a lot of people that train predominantly using purely linear approaches to training, they're either one, always getting injured, or two, they're plateauing a lot. And then you'll hear a lot of them say things like, I think I'm going to switch up my rep schemes this week, or I think, maybe I need to deload this week. And then it's almost like they intuitively know that what they're doing isn't really sustainable. And then they kind of just end up reverting back to this almost like pseudo non-linear approach to begin with.
Yeah, I was with the non-linear thing too. I was thinking, like, speaking of outside the box, right? I was looking at my stocks the other day, and I was looking back at like the past month, year, 5 years, and looking at just the little lines, the little ups and downs, right? And I was thinking, this isn't that much different than training. No one's, even back when I bought a jump training book. And speaking of our early learning experiences, mine was, well, what's the best program in the back of Slam magazine? And thankfully, this thing called The Science of Jumping was there, and it was 10 times better than like the air alerts and all the high rep plyo stuff that I had gotten that would work for like a couple weeks and then start to flatline. But even that program had mentioned, it was very clear. It's like, look, your results on this program are not going to be in a linear fashion. And I will say that it was more of a linear program in the sense of here's phase one, here's phase two, but it's like it's going to be up, down, and it's going to trend towards getting better. But it's not like every week you're going to get X amount better. So I found that I've always thought that way, but to me, it's like just sitting there and looking at this line from something else. I'm like, yeah, this is how it is, how it tends to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that a lot of people don't understand with non-linear training to begin with is that you're not going to see necessarily these gradual improvements, from like week 1 to week 2, and then from week 2 to week 3. It's going to be kind of, sporadic and a little all over the place. Obviously, the trend is going to be up over time. Like if you were to look at it, over like a year's time, because you obviously want to make progress. but it's different, than in these linear approaches where you might make really good progress for 2 or 3 weeks, but then you kind of hit this point where maybe for like 2 to 3 months you're not making any progress.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of things to be considered. And so going back to Louis Simmons' program, I think a lot of people are familiar with the conjugate system, but for those who aren't, could you just explain what that is in terms of what you're doing with it? Because I know you had said, and it's true, it's the methods we use for athletes are different than powerlifters who lift in suits. And
yeah.
So what is that method, and what are you doing with it that is specific to training athletes?
Yeah, so the conjugate system itself, when you think about West Side Barbell, or you think about, the phrase, the conjugate system, that's typically going to be associated with like, you're doing a lot of max effort. So you're maxing out a lot. You're doing a lot of, stuff with bands and chains, and a lot of that stuff is useful. But, again, I think people kind of miss out on, the structure of the training itself, which is kind of this idea that you need to be constantly rotating different exercises and different training means so that you're never adapting. Well, I don't want to say not adapting, but you're not getting used to any one thing. And you're also not going to burn out, because if you're, training in kind of a linear fashion where you're doing the same exercises week in and week out, it's going to be difficult to continue to make progress like that. And it also kind of predisposes you to certain, injuries, specifically overuse injuries, because you're constantly beating up the same muscle groups over and over. So the conjugate system kind of, is a way to almost build in deloading into the program. And that's kind of done just by constantly rotating either different exercises, different rep schemes, different training techniques. And so that kind of eliminates the need to, always deload, because it's basically built into the system.
Yeah, I know the West Side lifters, I think they would switch the exercises up in some manner every 2 weeks, I think it was, right? And I don't think that they were deloading. It would just be, okay, 2 weeks, then switch. That's correct, wasn't it?
Yeah, so that's what they did for, like, if they had a quote unquote like dynamic effort day, where they're doing like speed squats, they would generally do 2 to 3 weeks of, like the same exercise. So maybe it's like a squat with bands. But then for the max effort exercises, so, the main lift where they're maxing out, those lifts would change every week. And then the accessory exercises would also change every week.
Okay. So in the typical system, it was one max effort day for, let's just say, lower body and upper body, and then one dynamic effort day. And the max effort changed every week, and the dynamic changed every 2 to 3, and the accessories changed every week.
Yeah. So that's the way they did it. But, that's not necessarily, I wouldn't say that's like a hard rule. If you follow the general guideline of, kind of frequent change, and variety, you can kind of do it really however you want, or in a way that you see would fit the specific athletes that you're working with. So you could do it, every other week. You could do it maybe 2 weeks in a row and then change. You could do it every single week. It kind of just depends. I think even changing the way you change the exercises up could be beneficial as well.
Yeah, sure thing. So in terms of how this shakes out for you, and let's say you're programming a month of training for an athlete, how does this end up looking like in what you're doing for them?
So, in terms of, I guess you could say like the max effort training, we don't really do like a traditional max effort. We'll have a day where maybe they're focusing on, a specific big lift. So it might be a bench press, it could be a squat, it could be a deadlift. And we're taking that lift, and we may be doing a max effort with it, but it's not necessarily like a 1 rep max. Like we have some weeks where maybe they're doing 2 sets of the heaviest they can go for 8. The week after that might be, one set of the heaviest they could go for 3 on a different exercise. And basically what we're doing is we're creating this big list of, generally, like if we're training lower body, we'll have 2 or 3 primary exercises that we use. So we may have a narrow stance squat, we might have a wide stance squat, and then we might have, a trap bar or a conventional deadlift. And then we're basically taking those core 2 or 3 exercises, and then we're changing the way that we do them every week. So one week there might be bands, the next week it might be done off blocks, or chains. And then we basically keep a record of, their 1 rep max on, let's say, a wide stance box squat. And then, we'll keep another record of their 8 rep max on a wide stance box squat with, chains or something like that. So they have this big list of things that they're basically trying to beat every time they come into training. And it works extremely well because, they always feel like they're making an improvement, which they are. They're never coming into the gym and not able to hit some type of PR. And so that's another great thing with just the system in general, is that when they come in, like let's say they're doing, they're scheduled to do maybe a max that day. If for whatever reason they're not really feeling up to it, we'll say, okay, well, maybe let's try to beat your 8 rep max. And sometimes you'll find that a lot of kids, maybe they can't get anywhere near their 1 rep max that day, but they'll easily blow their 8 rep max out of the water. So again, that kind of goes back to sort of how the body is adapting in this non-linear fashion. And you can basically respect that by having this variability, and then sometimes even the ability to choose what you want to do just based on how you're feeling that day. So that's kind of how we do, I guess you could say, the max effort training. So we don't really have them, do a 1 rep max necessarily every week, but they are hitting some type of a max, be it an 8 or a 5 or maybe even a 3. And then occasionally cycling in those singles in there as well. And then, that would be they would have an upper body and a lower body day like that. So one day would be specialized or dedicated towards, a squat or a bench press. And then the other day would be, you would have one day that would be maybe a squat or a deadlift. And then the next day would be a bench press or, some type of an overhead press variation. And then they would have 2 days after that would follow kind of a similar dynamic effort style training day, except they're not necessarily doing, speed squats. Like they might be doing like a heavy jump, or some weeks it may be a speed squat. Sometimes we'll cycle in tempos on that day. So maybe they're doing a squat with, an 8-second eccentric. Those days are almost even more variable. So we're kind of just always cycling in different training intensities, tempos, and exercises on that dynamic effort day.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. A couple of follow-up questions off that for you. One is, how often do you actually write the workout in advance, would you say? Like where it's written to the T? Or is every day kind of up for grabs on some level in terms of what you're actually going to do?
So we basically what I do is I'll take kind of what they've done for the past 2 or 3 weeks. And I kind of have a similar template that I follow. So we typically tend, like let's say they're doing a dynamic effort day. We typically will start them out with, something that might be kind of similar to a triphasic. So 2 weeks of an iso, 2 weeks of an eccentric, 2 weeks of something speed oriented. And so that's kind of almost the base template, but then the way that we implement certain training means or variations is kind of just based on what I feel like they haven't done in a while. So kind of going back to the max effort day, I'll basically take a look at what they did, 2 or 3 weeks ago. So like, let's say they hit a heavy 8. I'm not going to have them hit another heavy 8 the following week. We might do something that's kind of a little far away from that. So they might be hitting like a heavy 3 or a 1. And that's going to be a good way to basically ensure that they're never detraining anything. So it's not super structured in the sense that every single week needs to be, super planned, or I guess you could say based on anything that they did the week before, aside from just kind of making sure that they're not really being too repetitive in some of the exercises and the training means that they're using, if that kind of makes sense. So even kind of going back to like some of their accessory exercises, like week 1 might be a heavy split squat. So they might be doing like 2 sets of 6 to 12. And then the following week after that, we might have them do something like an iso split squat. So even with things like the isos, that's going to be changing every week. We're never doing isos every single week like a lot of people do. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but we're constantly just changing the contraction types, the rep schemes, and then the exercises. And so those changes will be kind of based on what they did the week before. But other than that, a lot of the workouts are written almost on the fly sometimes.
Yeah. And the longer I've been around a variety of different coaches, I have looked and respected much more the doing things on the fly. My own warm-ups have become, for my athletes, are and this is where I actually like to. I'll pose this question to you now. I'll say in my more structured programs, the teams that I have more structure, for me, it's actually a little flip-flopped on some level. The accessories I tend to actually change the least. And I was thinking about how we were saying with Westside, the max efforts changed every week. That's the biggest neural demand, like the most stressful thing, right? So it makes sense that would get changed quite often. The dynamic day probably, I guess it depends on a few things, but it seems like to me that would be a little less stress to the nervous system, a little less threat than the heaviest bar on your back possible. And so maybe that could be cycled less. But the auxiliaries, they're the least stressful. So on some level, it makes sense that they could be, if we're looking at like a threat level, right? A threat, and let's not do this again for a while, potential level, that makes sense on one end. But then also I enjoy doing something in my teams where I use the warm up as the accessory, so to speak, where we'll do a 20 to 30 minute warm up with a ton of different calisthenic based movements and a lot of different stuff that you could call accessory on, but it's more like human movement based. That's always different. And then there's the meat and the potatoes after that for the most part. And then we might do a little bit other accessories at the end. And in that sense, it is highly variable, and I like that too. So I'm curious what your take is on why those accessories are mixed up so often, and that maybe the dynamic day less, if that makes sense.
Well, so the accessories themselves actually aren't going to change nearly that often. So I think I probably didn't explain this well enough, previously, but with the accessories, we're basically doing kind of like a 1 week on and then 1 week off approach. So like week 1 might be a split squat, week 2 might be an iso split squat, and then week 3 might be right back to the same split squat. So there is variety in the accessories, but it's not changing nearly as much as the max effort lifts. So the max effort lifts are going to be constantly changing, in the way that we do them, from, bands or chains, the exercise itself, pulling from blocks or pulling from a deficit. But with the accessories themselves, we'll generally have, 1 or 2 variations of a specific exercise per muscle group. So if we're doing, let's just say triceps, we might have 1 week where we do a tricep extension, and the week after that might be, an overhead tricep extension. So you're basically just hitting different parts of the muscle. But it's not like you're doing like 20 different tricep exercises. So the accessories actually stay pretty simple. We do rotate them every other week, but then they kind of rotate right back. So there's not nearly as much variety in the accessory movements as there is in the max effort movements, at least in terms of a lot of the implements that we're using with them, if that kind of makes sense. So we're not really like throwing bands or chains on accessory exercises or anything like that. It's just kind of slight modifications in, foot position or stuff like that.
Sure. So that makes sense from an every other week. So, and that's actually how I tend to run my main stuff, is typically in an every other week format. So we might do like a full depth squat week 1, a 2/3 depth squat week 2, and then week 3 go back to full, and then go back to 2/3. So I tend to run that. I just call it a 14-day cycle, because you're doing week 1's different than week 2. I kind of want to, like, something in me is like wants to get to that 21-day cycle where it would go, say, full squat to 2/3 to a speed half squat and then go back to the top. But I'm like, I think I need another year to master this, or 2 to master this, the 2-week cycle before I branch out to 3. But I mean, it sounds like you are more on that 3-week, 4-week. Do you have cycles? Like, are you like, okay, I'm going to, we did a 1 RM squat day today, week 1 here, maybe we'll hit this again on week 4. Is that in your view, or is it pretty much just what the athlete's feeling on that day? It's like, okay, I think this is what you can PR, and your highest chance of PRing today is in this, so let's hit this.
Yeah, no, it's definitely structured in that way. So we'll have we don't want to make, or we want to make sure that they're basically not doing anything that they've already done, I guess you could say, like the weeks before that. So like if they do a wide stance box squat, the following week we might do a wide stance box squat, but change the height a little bit. So I think kind of going back to what you said in terms of like, how much variation you have in there, you do almost have to master less variation first. I think 3 weeks is kind of the limit that you can reasonably get away with in terms of how much you change things. So if you have, a squat, a deadlift, and then, another squat variation, that's kind of the limit where you want to stay in terms of, how often you're rotating through different exercises. Because if different variations, you kind of get to a point where you no longer get the benefits of the variation itself, because you kind of, that motor pattern isn't as fresh. And so you kind of tend to lose some of the progress that you make. And that kind of goes back to the accessory exercises as well, because, we did initially try kind of changing them, every 2 to 3 weeks, instead of that 1 week on and 1 week off approach. And what I found in my own personal training was that you tend to lose some of the progress that you made because you haven't been doing the exercise frequently enough. So, we always want to make sure that they're kind of doing things that are going to be based on what they've done, in the past month. So it's not completely random. It is kind of structured around what they've already done. And then if they're feeling a certain way, like if they feel like, okay, my hips are super tight today, or my back is super tight, then that's when we'll change it. So we don't really, I don't really have them change up the exercises or the training protocols unless they specifically feel like that's kind of where they need to head that day, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure thing. That is the thing I'm interested in, because I talked to myself about the difference between, you got a 14-day cycle, and that's pretty good. You're moving to a 21. Now you're thinning out that stimulus a little bit more. The more you keep moving beyond 21, like you said, you don't want to hit the same movement like once every 6 weeks or something like that. It's a little bit too
yeah,
thin.
Exactly.
I saw the first I don't know if it was like maybe been a Perform Better conference, or I think it was Sports Performance, but I remember seeing someone speak he was a strength coach at Rose-Hulman University for a while, and then went and did his own thing in the private sector. And his program, as I remember, was kind of similar to yours. He had it but it was all mapped out in the sense like, it's like, we don't repeat a movement or a lift it was something like once every 4, 5, 6 weeks they didn't repeat it. And apparently they were getting good results. I think they were doing stuff that was close and in the ballpark, but it was
Right.
everything was pretty stretched out. And I always kind of wondered, I hadn't heard from that guy or any writing on his system or anything of that since, and shoot, that was 15 years ago. I'd wondered what that was. And so, cause I always look at, I think there's always those limits, what's the closest you can reasonably do? And then what's the farthest you can reasonably go without repeating something? And then I think the goal of it being a big thing too, I wanted to ask you this is, I also think in terms of, you have the Bondarchuk training system, or even 1x20, which I think is very, that little essence, that repeatable format is very much in there, where something is repeated over and over again for a particular period of time. And so that's almost one end of the spectrum. And then I think what you're doing, or that Rose Holman coach, or a 21-day cycle is kind of on the other. And I think they can both work for people in a very good way. But what do you think the big, I guess what you could say, well, what's your thoughts on the big differences, and what's the closest that you will go in a situation, or if you have a novice athlete who's just starting, or what's the closest that training sessions would end up getting together for you, or of a similar stimuli? There we go.
Well, so in terms of things, I think there's a big advantage to things being similar or predictable when you're trying to learn something. So if you're getting ready to peak for a competition, or you're peaking for a big event, I think that's when training can get a little bit more structured, or I guess you could say linearly structured. Because, I think what a lot of people don't understand about the Bondarchuk system is that it is really good for peaking, especially for athletes that already have like a really solid base of movement variety, and just that really good foundation of general strength kind of already under their belt. I think a lot of the things in the Bondarchuk system, they're going to be kind of predicated on motor learning, coordination, and then just general skill acquisition. Whereas with more of a non-linear program, because you're not doing any one exercise or event as often, there's not going to be a huge skill component there. So most of your adaptations that you're going to get in kind of a non-linear, style of a program, they're going to happen a little bit slower, but they're going to be predicated a little bit more on kind of like raw improvements in strength, speed, and power without that skill component there, which is good, because you'll see a lot of guys that can maybe they can squat a lot, but it's like, how much of that strength was you actually being strong, and how much of it was just from you being, really proficient at the skill itself. Because being really proficient at the skill of squatting doesn't mean a whole lot in sports, but the strength that you gain from it potentially does. And the actual skill of squatting itself isn't going to be super, applicable to any type of a sport aside from, something like powerlifting. So, what I like about non-linear conjugate forms of training is that it sets you up with this really solid base of, I guess you could say, just natural or raw ability. And then you can kind of take those abilities, so like strength, speed, and power, and you're able to translate it into a specific skill a little bit easier. When you move over to something like, the Bondarchuk system, where there's a lot less variability in the movements that you're doing, because then you kind of shift from this very general approach to training to kind of the skill or the skill acquisition side of training, where a lot of the movements that you're going to be doing in the Bondarchuk system, I think, are pretty sport specific, right?
Oh yeah, it's all based on the transfer scale. I mean, you get to some accessory stuff at the bottom that's not so much, but the majority of it has a very distinct purpose.
Right. So at that point, that's where skill acquisition and the motor learning side of things can be useful, because it's going to allow you to transfer, your newfound proficiency in that skill into whatever specific sport activity you're trying to transfer it to. Whereas just getting generally good at a squat, that's going to be a little bit different than honing the skill of a squat itself, if that kind of makes sense. So, I think in the Bondarchuk system, the skill component of learning those exercises is going to be a lot more important because they're specific, as opposed to being more of like a general form of development, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. As you were talking, I mean, I kind of already had one idea, and a few sprung into my own mind as you were speaking on it. And one was, I think, the idea of when we talk high frequency training that's pretty repeatable, doing a similar thing, or even, I forgot to mention, even stuff like Pavel's Power to the People, where you're just doing 2x5 deadlifts every day or whatever. I think the key is always that you never get into threat, or that like a minimal amount of our many systems, I don't think it's just one system, it's a lot, is you have to have at least not many systems going into threat where the nervous system is apt to shut it down. And even the Bondarchuk system too, and you touched on this as well, and the idea that I think it's more about expressing what an athlete already has in terms of skill acquisition on a level. I do think that the high frequency non-threat type work can get you to little physiological stuff. But I think about it, it's even doing something like throwing a hammer every day or a discus. There's a lot of degrees of freedom in that. There's a lot of different little micro adjustments you could make to the body and throwing the implement, probably more so than how many ways you can wiggle your body in doing a heavy squat or even a jump off one leg or something, or even a sprint. I think there's a few less little subtle degrees of freedom in those movements, and therefore muscles and joints are going to get like kind of pounded a little bit more in a very specific way. I think you have more options when you're throwing something for the most part. And so maybe that's something to do with it too. But it does, to me, I'm like, wow, it really goes back to what you were saying in the sense of like these bigger, for developing athlete and developing physiological qualities, pretty much the more intense the stimuli, the more we really need to vary it up and change it week to week and do it a little bit less often.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. So I had one thought. I forgot to mention this before, but you had said it too. This is going back to the last question, but with high frequency and peaking and tapering, do you run things any differently there when an athlete's getting close to their? I guess it would be. I mean, that's more like a track athlete or an individual sport, right? But I have always found that, as you said, I really enjoy if I'm running like a program and it's for the most part going on for 12 weeks or something, or building up to something. The last 2 or maybe 3 or 4 of those, that 12-week period, I really like dropping into a very high frequency mode to really express. I find it really helps to express what's been built. And you had pointed to that a little bit in what you were saying before. And so what do you do anything differently if you have an individual sport athlete and they're looking to taper, or they have a big competition or anything in that nature coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what we typically tend to do, just because we do have a lot of athletes in the room at once, is we'll basically have 2 programs on the board. So one is going to be more of an off-season program, and then the other one's going to be, I guess you could say, a little bit more in-season or peaking oriented. And so the peaking program is basically going to be kind of similar to the off-season program. It just basically is going to be a little bit higher frequency. So there's going to be less variation in there. We're not going to be maxing out or doing a whole lot of, high volume exercises, within that program. But it is going to be very similar in structure in terms of, everybody's going to be doing a squat. Everybody's going to be doing some type of a jump variation. So the general structure stays the same. But we tone down the variability just a little bit less. And we do up the frequency just a little bit more. And then typically they're going to be training, instead of 4 to 5 days a week, they might be training just kind of depending on their schedule, maybe 2 or 3 days a week. especially as, their practices start to increase. I mean, especially like a lot of the track kids, some of those guys are in there, practicing like 5 or 6 days a week. So it's not practical to have them in the gym, 4 to 5 times a week as well.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, it definitely gets a little bit interesting once you hit in that taper period. I was going to ask you, do you have a different, so you answered it there, do you have any different workouts in a large group setting? So there is a little bit of distinction there depending on what train you're on.
Yeah, so I mean, they're going to be doing a little bit more sprinting generally, so like short sprints and stuff like that. But in terms of the exercises itself, the exercises are going to be pretty similar. We're just going to change like basically the contraction speed, I guess you could say. So instead of doing a vertical jump, maybe they're doing a band assisted jump. Instead of doing a squat at 70% for a dynamic day, maybe they're doing 50%, and they're moving it a little bit faster, and maybe they're doing it with bands instead of doing tempo work. So, it's basically a lot of the same exercises. So maybe the off-season guys are doing, 8x3 on squat at 70%. In season or peaking guys might be doing the same thing, but instead of 70%, it might be at 50%. And then instead of doing, a loaded vertical jump, maybe it's a band assisted jump, or just something that's going to be, a little bit more of like a higher speed or a higher velocity type of an exercise. So those are kind of some of the typical changes that we would make. It's just going to be a little bit less load. And then again, instead of doing, 4 or 5 training days a week where they have an upper body and a lower body day, it might be, 2 or 3 days a week, and maybe they're doing full body workouts instead of upper and lower splits, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Grant, you talked about isometrics a little bit. You talked about doing a split squat, an isometric split squat, and the auxiliary world. How can you take me a little bit through how you're utilizing isometrics in your program in terms of muscle length, recovery, anything like that, or other things you're using in that, trying to achieve that same thing? Because you said you rotate them through. Are you just some examples there on how you're utilizing that portion of your program?
Yeah, so I really like isometrics for kind of that ability to, whenever you're doing an isometric, you're basically doing something that's very endurance oriented. If you're holding a split squat for 3 to 5 minutes, that's going to improve your ability to kind of to handle, a little bit more local, or to have a little bit more local endurance in whatever muscle you're training. So I really like them from that standpoint. Obviously there's a lot of other benefits as well. But we'll kind of cycle those in every other week. So, and we usually use them as an accessory movement. So again, like if we're doing, say week 1 is a split squat and they're doing like a heavy 2 sets of 6 to 8, the following week might be an iso split squat where they're doing 1 to 2 sets of a 1 to 3 minute hold. And so we basically try to progress them kind of up to the point where if they can hold a 3 to 4 minute split squat, we basically make them add weight. So they're going to, next time they do the exercise, they're going to start at maybe a minute, but now they're going to have like some 5-pound dumbbells or, something just really light. And then they're going to basically progress their way all the way back up to 3 to 4 minutes. And then once they can get there, they're going to add a little bit of weight. We actually had a couple guys that did a 5-minute split squat with, I think, 50 pounds.
Whoa.
So that's
any chance?
Yeah. It's pretty insane because,
gnarly.
Most of the time when you see people doing those, they're just their body weight, which, I mean, even a 5-minute body weight split squat is pretty impressive. And then if you can add load on top of that, assuming you can maintain your position and you can kind of maintain a good muscle contraction without just kind of getting lazy in that position, that's super valuable just from like a local muscular endurance standpoint. So that's kind of how we use ISOs. We typically don't use them every week. I think with anything else, ISOs need to be rotated as well, because while they're not going to be super heavy on the joints, they're obviously going to be taxing different systems heavily as well. So we rotate those like we would anything else. And that's also going to allow you to make, better improvements in them as well, because if you're doing them every week, it's kind of hard to get to that point where you're able to, to add time, every time that you do them. So yeah, we pretty much just treat ISOs like we would any other accessory movement. We're going to constantly rotate them in and out, and we'll do those with most body parts. So we'll have, like the ISO split squat. We'll have an ISO glute bridge. We might have, one of our favorites to do now is the reverse plank. So you're basically kind of sitting on the GHD, kind of facing up. And so that's a good ISO that we'll do for just kind of the superficial abs. So we kind of basically take all of their main accessory movements, and then we also have an ISO variation of those same exercises that we'll do with them every other week.
Yeah, that I've done a 5-minute ISO lunge. I mean, the split squat's an ISO lunge, basically, yes.
Yeah, my bad.
No, I mean, it's just terminology. It's just, maybe it's called different parts of the country or whatever. I'm sure you I will have a different name for it. So no worries. I was just going to say that movie, it's hard enough, but just body weight. So holding 50s is pretty gnarly. That would be, do you have that on a video somewhere? I'll throw it in the show notes if you do.
I think I might actually. And it wasn't 2 50s. It was 50 pounds total. So they were doing like 25-pound dumbbells.
Still legit. That's still pretty difficult.
Yeah, but I'll see if I can find that and send it to you, because it was insane. And that's another thing too, is the athletes love to compete on those. That's another element where you can really add, competition into that to keep the engagement high.
Yeah, for sure. That's what I was going to say. In rotating that stuff, it makes sense because that stuff is mentally taxing, especially if you're taking anything for 5 minutes. Even 3 to 4, it can really get up there in the mentally taxing point. And I think that if we look at all the systems of the body, that system of systems, that mental, emotional, psychological is way more important than I think we tend to give it credit for, especially when we're talking about PRing every week and we want to feel good and good about ourselves every day. And you have that mental lag from, sucked last week, but it was good. It felt good, but there's just stuff. There's a residue, and so that's interesting. I've never heard anyone recycling ISOs like that, but yeah, that's cool. That's a cool insight and way of doing it. I'll definitely have to take a look into that.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because I actually had an athlete walk up to me a couple weeks ago, and they're like, "If you made us do those every week, I would not train with you anymore." and it's funny because he was kind of telling me, like, I like the fact that there's that break in there that, I know, okay, this week I'm going to do something hard, but it's not that, and then next week I might have to do it, but there's kind of some, I guess you could say it's just nice to not be able to, or it's nice to be able to not have to do that or worry about having to do something that intense every single week.
Yeah, it almost fits in the finisher mentality. And I know that Dan John had in one of his books, they was Never Let Go, had a dice they would roll, and there's one of 6 finishers you could do or something like that. But it's like there's 6 for a reason, or to do the same finisher it's just gonna get you. And I like that idea of mixing it up when you're taking it to the house. It really does. And I've heard stories of systems that really rely on that stuff, and it takes a special type of athlete to really be able to bear with that stuff for an extended period of time, doing it very regularly. And it definitely says something about, I think, your ability to be resilient and compete. But it also, I think that to hit the broadest spectrum of athletes, and even to give those athletes who are that mentally resilient a little break, there's something about that. I think that's cool. I have one last question, which really is just a nuts and bolts one, and that's based off everything we're talking about. Let's just talk about like max effort and dynamic effort. Then something just simple, so lower body squat, something simple. Take me through what maybe like 3 weeks might look like. So for my max and dynamic effort day, what may a 3-week program with Grant Fowler end up looking like if I go to your gym? Just talking about that day, and we'll have that be the last one today.
Yeah. So, week 1, you might be coming in, and like, let's say you're doing a max effort day. So your max effort day might be, let's say, a trap bar deadlift. That's week 1. And we might be having you go up to the heaviest you can go for 5 with chains on the bar. And then week 2, maybe we're having you do like a wide stance box squat. And let's say that week we're having you go up to the heaviest you can go for 1. And then week 3 might be a narrow stance squat. So with that week, maybe you're going up to the heaviest you can go for 5. And then that would be kind of your like base 3 weeks. And then you would kind of cycle back through that again, except week 4 would be the trap bar deadlift again, but maybe you're not doing it with chains. And maybe this time, instead of doing, the heaviest you can go for 8, maybe you're doing the heaviest you can go for 1, and that's off blocks. So you're constantly repeating those same 3 main core lifts that you have. So trap bar deadlift, wide stance box squat, narrow stance box squat, and then you're just kind of changing the rep schemes and the implements that you use on those exercises. So that could be like bands or chains or something like that. The dynamic effort days, those are typically going to be like a 2-week wave. So you might have, a squat at 70%, and maybe for 2 weeks, you're going 6 seconds on the way down. Week 3, you might start maybe like an isometric style block where you're doing a 6-second pause at the bottom of that squat at 70%. Maybe you would do that for 2 weeks. And then you would have another 2 weeks where you're doing like a concentric phase where you're doing, 70% off of pins and you're trying to move it as fast as you can. So it's almost kind of similar to like a triphasic thing. Doesn't necessarily have to be set up the same way. It's just kind of nice to rotate through some of those different muscle contractions. So dynamic effort day, usually, a 2-week wave. And then the max effort exercises are going to be, 3 different exercises in those 3 weeks.
Yeah, you said 70% on the dynamic squat. I'm assuming, what's the rep ranges on that? And I'm assuming it's an all-out, explosive, whatever the tempo is, it's still an explosive concentric.
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the percentage. So if they're doing 70%, it might be a 5x3. If the next cycle they're doing 50% with band tension, it might be 8x3. So typically, if the intensity is a little bit higher, we're going to lower the volume down to something like a 5x3 or a 6x3, especially if they're doing tempo work. And then if they're doing a speed or a dynamic, like a traditional dynamic effort style day, the percentage might go down just a little bit to maybe 50 or 60%. And then they're typically going to be doing that against some type of accommodating resistance, like a band or a chain.
Sure. Yeah, cool. I like asking those questions because it really helps me to visualize how this all looks and plays out when we actually set it up. And so it's always good to get that, to really end on that level of visualization. These conversations and the one on variety in programs always really gets me into that whole the repetition without repetition, or even looking at parkour and parkour athletes and what they're able to pull off, having a high variability type setup versus something that's more free flowing. I think there's so many. That level of discussion and topic can get really deep in a sense, but I think it's important to start with the creativity and the results and just things that pragmatically work. And so I love having these talks, and it was awesome enjoying your creative process today, Grant. So thanks for keying us in on your training methods.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, man.
Thanks for listening today. We're glad you could tune in with us. I really enjoyed putting these together, and it was awesome to have a programming chat. We talk about a lot of awesome things on this show, but where it all started for me was very much exercises and programming. So it's good to come back to that, and it's good to talk to creative minds like Grant. If you enjoyed the show, don't hesitate to leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, whatever you're tuning in on. We would really appreciate it, and it really helps spread the message and what we're doing and helping people everywhere learn a little bit more about athletics and the human body. Also, don't forget to support our sponsor. SimplyFaster.com supplies of high-end training technology. They have an awesome blog, amazing store with the best of in the sports tech category, so be sure to check them out. All right, we'll see you next week. Have a good one.